Hi, I'm Brian with BibleStudy.net, and we're back to continue our comparative religion study. We left off in the last video talking about Plato, and just want to put out some concluding thoughts and facts and figures on Plato here as a historical figure. What else do we know about him? Well, when it comes to his writings, as we said at the end of the last video, Plato didn't start writing until after the death of Socrates around 399, possibly starting in the early 380s BC. So if we put this on our timeline, where does this compare to Moses? Well, Moses is writing in the 14th to 13th century BC, so this is about 1,000 years later that Plato begins to put his ideas down. After extensive travels, as we've seen, to places like Greece, of course throughout Greece where Plato himself had lived, but also Egypt and Italy, all of which he may have come into contact with various worldviews before he started his writing, and possibly very much came potentially in contact with the writings of Moses, who was 1,000 years older than him. And so if there is to be speculation about whether or not ideas in Plato are original, or whether or not there's ideas in Moses or Christianity that develop and borrow from Platonism, and we look at the historical question, certainly Plato comes much later than Old Testament Christianity or Old Testament Judaism, and therefore we would have to conclude that the borrowing, the influence, if there is any, comes from Plato borrowing from Moses and not the other way around. But let's look at one last piece of evidence here concerning Plato, and that is concerning the documents themselves that we have of Plato. So Plato, remember, is writing sometime in the 4th century BC, after the death of Socrates. So when is the earliest copy that we have today, a copy of these writings from Plato? Well, that doesn't come until 900 AD. So now we're talking about sometime between about 1,300 years after Plato started writing, we arrive at the first copy of Plato's writings that we have in existence today. So this is an enormous amount of time, 1,200, 1,300 years between Plato and Plato's original writing and the copies we have today. And how many copies do we have? Well, we only have 7 copies of these works from Plato in this sense. And so we're talking about not very many copies that really are originating much, much later than the writings of Plato. And compared to Old Testament Judaism and its documents, or Christianity, as we talked about earlier in the study, this is very, very minuscule, very small amount of documentation historically for us to be able to reconstruct who Plato was, to be able to say with certainty that he said what he's reported to have said, did what he's reported to have done at the time he is supposed to have lived. We can be very much more certain with regard to Jesus Christ, for instance, because of the thousands of copies we have in a much closer time frame, as we spent time talking about earlier. And this actually takes us to Christianity. I want to talk a little bit about that. We've already given all of the historical documentation for Christianity early on, talking about 5,300 manuscripts in Greek, some of them starting as early as maybe a couple decades in terms of their writing after Jesus Christ. The New Testament itself was written anywhere from maybe the 50s to 100 AD, so you're talking literally about decades between Jesus' life and the authorship of the accounts of his life, by people who were in close proximity, apostles, people that knew Jesus personally, or people that had been sent forth by Jesus as apostles. So very close proximity eyewitnesses, we talked about that. We talked about the number of copies that we have and how far they date from the originals. In contrast to Socrates, we found that we have originals of Christian documents of the entire New Testament within a couple hundred years, 250, 300 years of the writing of those originals. And so we're on very good ground. In fact, as we said, that if you use the New Testament as the standard, you would be able to discard any other ancient historical figure or event and only have the New Testament, because the New Testament evidence exceeds every other historical figure and event and document that much. And so what else can we say about Christianity in terms of this idea of influence and where it gets its ideas from? You know, is it borrowing from other movements like Platonism? Is it borrowing from other Far Eastern philosophies? Where do we get Christianity from? And the fact is that Christianity, and scholars know this today, is a Jewish movement. It is a Jewish sect in the 1st century. Later, after the death of Jesus Christ, as they began to do missionary work, more and more Gentiles began to convert effectively to this sect of Judaism, but it was a Jewish sect. So let's sort of establish this here. I want to read a couple quotes here about Christianity in its early days and how scholars categorize it today. According to Britannica, Christianity is a religion stemming from the teachings of Jesus in the 1st century AD. Christianity was originally a movement of Jews who accepted Jesus as the Messiah. Historical views of the essence, or early views. Jesus and the earliest members of the Christian faith tradition were Jews, and they thus understood the faith tradition inherited by the Hebrew people in Israel. They were monotheists devoted to the God of Israel. And as we go a little further here in Britannica under their article on Judaism, so now this isn't their article on Christianity, this is their article on Judaism. What do they have to say? They talk about the period under Roman rule and how during this period under Roman rule a number of new groups or sects of Judaism developed. After the death of King Herod, a political group known as the Herodians, there was also the Zealots that they mention here, but they go on to say that the rise of Christianity was by far the most important sectarian development of the Roman period. Many scholars now regard primitive Christianity as part of a broad spectrum of attitudes within Judaism itself, rather than as peripheral to Jewish development. Indeed, Jesus himself may now be classified as an apocalyptic prophet whose announced intentions were not to abrogate the Torah, but to fulfill it. It is possible to envision a direct line between Jewish currents, both in Palestine and throughout the diaspora, and Christianity, particularly in theology and especially with the doctrine of the Logos or Word as an intermediary between God and the world. The Septuagint in particular, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that dates to about the 3rd or 2nd century BC, played an important part in converting Jews and Jewish sympathizers to Christianity. So when we ask this question of comparative religions, and of course as I've indicated before, we are going to see as we compare more and more things about Hinduism to Buddhism to Jainism, Ajivika, Taoism, that essentially these, and even Druidism, are one large-scale, virtually denominations of the same religion across the globe. And so we're not really comparing a large number of other religions, we're actually comparing very few religions to one another. And by showing that Christianity is part of the Jewish tradition, particularly 1st, 2nd century Christianity as a Jewish movement, as a Jewish sect, we're seeing that when we talk about Christianity, we're really talking historically about Judaism. And so we don't have Judaism versus Christianity, although obviously they do have some things that they need to be reconciled between the two of them and explain that. But essentially Christianity is a Jewish point of view. So we're contrasting Jewish monotheism with this large-scale pantheistic, polytheistic religion that we find everywhere else. It's mystical in nature. And so that's the point we want to make there about Christianity. Now, I want to put the video on pause for just a moment, and we'll come back and we're going to talk about the next group, which is Gnosticism and how it develops, when it develops, and what we know about it.